the mole. A plain English video. By Jennifer Sherburne. Alright, the mole can be a really hard concept to comprehend. So hopefully this video breaks it down and simplifies it enough for even the everyday person to understand. Alright, the concept of the mole. The mole probably loses the most people because it can be equal to 3 different quantities. A measuring quantity like grams, a counting quantity, so counting maybe something like atoms, or a measuring quantity like volume, so you'd be measuring in something like liters. Alright, let's simplify even more and use something that everybody's familiar with. If you had a pair of shoes, how many would you have? 2, right? Alright, if you had a pair of tickets, how many would you have? Again, 2, right? Okay, so let's talk about something else. How about a dozen eggs? Well, everybody knows that a dozen is equal to 12. So you'd have 12 eggs. How about a dozen apples? Well, if you had a dozen of eggs, that was 12. A dozen apples would be 12 also. Okay, sticking with the idea of apples, there are again 3 ways that you could buy apples. Alright, the first way that you could buy apples is by counting, like we said. Maybe 3 apples cost $2.50. Okay, that's one way. Another way, assuming that 1 dozen apples equals 2 kilograms, which is about 4.4 pounds for the American viewers, you could buy apples by mass, which is why you often see scales hanging all around the produce aisle. You just need to know what the grocer is charging per pound or kilogram. For example, maybe $1.29 a pound, or $2.79 per kilogram, whatever the grocer is charging. Okay, so second way is by mass. Lastly, the third way that you could buy apples is by volume. This is how most apples are sold at orchards. If you took a dozen apples, which is equal to 12 apples, you could probably fill up a bushel basket, which is how the orchards sell them. Maybe 12 of your apples are going to take up, let's say, 1/5 of the basket, or 20% of your bushel basket. If the farmer tells you that a bushel full is $12, but you only want 20%, you could give him $2.40 for your 12 apples, which filled up 1/5 of the basket. Alright, let's recap the 3 ways that you can buy apples. You can buy apples by counting. You just need to know how many a certain number costs, like 3 for $2.50, or 1 dozen or 12 apples would then cost $10. By mass, you need to know how much the grocer is charging per pound or kilogram. If you assume the average size apple, 1 dozen would weigh about 2 kilograms. And then the third way that we just mentioned was by volume, like the bushel basket or a graduated cylinder if you're measuring volume for a liquid. By volume, you need to know how much a certain volume, like a bushel or liter or gallon, costs. Maybe for the apple example, $12 a bushel. Alright, I think we're ready to move to make the connection between apples and the mole. Between apples and the mole. Let's start with the same way as apples, counting. Remember, if you had a dozen eggs, you had 12 eggs. If you had a dozen apples, you had that stack of 12 apples. As you already know, if you have a dozen of anything, you've got 12. The mole is like a dozen, but instead of being equal to 12, it's equal to a much bigger number. 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd power. Sorry, I can only write the number. It would take me way too long to come up with that many of anything. I don't even have enough room to take it out of scientific notation and write all the zeros. I think it'd be 602 with 21 zeros. Again, running out of room. So, you just get the idea that it's a super duper big number. Okay, so how about if you had a mole of popsicle sticks? How many popsicle sticks would you have? 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd popsicle sticks. Okay, how about if you had a mole of apples? If you had a mole of apples, 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd apples. Okay, how about if you had, this one's my favorite, how about if you had a mole of pennies? Exact same thing, 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. And for me, that would equal early retirement. Alright, I think we've got down that a mole of anything equals 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd, just as 1 dozen equals 12. By the way, scientists have a special name for that number, 6.02 times 10 to the 23rd. It's called Avogadro's number, and it's named after Amedeo Avogadro. He was an Italian scientist. Okay, the second method of buying apples was by mass. Remember that if you wanted a dozen apples, you need to know how much the grocer was selling them, for $1.29 a pound or maybe $2.49 a kilogram. Well, if we're talking about the mole, we're not going to the grocery store to find out how much we're going to use. Instead, we're going to use the periodic table of elements. Here's the key point. The atomic mass, so let's say we're talking carbon. Instead of apples, we're talking carbon. The atomic mass of an element is expressed in grams, is the mass of a mole of that element. So 1 mole of carbon would equal 12.01 grams. For every element, it has a different atomic mass, so 1 mole of every element is equal to a different number of grams. Here's another example. Let's say we had iron, atomic number 26. 1 mole of iron would weigh 55.8 grams. Okay? If we had 1 mole of helium, the atomic mass of helium is about 4, so 1 mole of helium would weigh 4 grams. Also remember that there are 7 elements that are diatomic on the periodic table, which means that they come in pairs. You can remember which elements are diatomic by going to number 7, nitrogen, and making a 7. Although we still just, you can see the green 7, we still just highlighted 6 elements. The 7th element is hydrogen. That's your 7th one. Those 7 elements come in pairs. So if we were talking about those 7 elements, we would have H2, because it's diatomic, N2, O2, F2, Cl2, Br2, and I2. Those are your 7 diatomic elements. So 1 mole of those elements would be double the mass because they're diatomic. For example, oxygen, which was O2, instead of 16 grams would be equal to 32 grams in a mole. Okay, there's a third way to buy apples. As we said, we could buy them by the bushel, which is buying by volume. There's also a third way to measure the mole. And you guessed it, by volume. The third method of measuring a mole using volume only works with gases. This is because the particles in gases are spaced so much farther than in liquids and solids. Here's the last method in its simplest form. 1 mole of any gas takes up 22.4 liters of space. And that's at standard temperature and pressure. So if you had 1 mole of, let's say, helium, because helium's a gas, you'd have 22.4 liters. It would take up 22.4 liters of space at standard temperature and pressure. If you had 1 mole of nitrogen, and again we said nitrogen was diatomic, so N2 would take up 22.4 liters of space. If you had 1 mole of carbon dioxide, which is a gas, you'd have 22.4 liters. Alright, so that's it in a nutshell, the 3 ways to measure a dozen or a mole of anything.